Welcome, everyone, to today's program hosted by ISM New Jersey. We would like to say hello to all of our ISM members, our chapter partners, and our guests to our program today. Please be sure to place your comments or questions in the chat function, as we would like to make this an interactive event and we want to hear from you. But for first thing, why don't you tell us where you're from? Just put it in the chat while I continue talking and let us know where you're calling in from. Today's topic is supply chain plasticity. Probably pronouncing that wrong, Stephen. What is it and why does it matter? I am pleased to welcome back my dear friend, Dr. Stephen Carnovale. He's an Associate Professor of Supply Chain Management at the College of Business at Florida Atlantic University. And Stephen is also the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Purchasing and Supply Management. At this point, I will now turn the program over to Stephen, who can talk to you about our topic today.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me back. I always love chatting with all the folks at ISM. So the interesting thing about this topic, and I think a lot of topics that myself and some other colleagues have been working on, is that it started all as a result in some ways of COVID, but the ideas have probably been around for longer. So when we were thinking about this topic, we observed a number of different scenarios that happened with this plasticity concept. And by the way, we're at an early stage with this work. And as an academic, I just love finding concepts that are not only academically interesting, but practically relevant. And so I encourage any commentary and any questions, please throw those in the chat. I'd love to take a look afterwards. But so the motivation behind all this, in some ways, actually, it's kind of funny that I'm talking about this at ISM, because it really started when ISM used to host the North American Research Symposium, NARS, this was in 2011, maybe 12 it could have been. And we were in Phoenix, Arizona, or Chandler, one of the two. And, we were me and a number of people were sitting there just talking as we do. And we learned about this Cisco system. So actually, no, it was 2012 because it was after the Fukushima incident that happened in Japan. So we were sitting around talking, and we started to learn about Cisco's sense and respond capabilities. They might not have coined it as such at the time, but certainly that's the moniker that they put on it now. And the whole idea behind it was that Cisco, during the nuclear disaster and the tsunami that hit Japan during that time, they were able to, through this program of constantly monitoring, completely reposition and repurpose inventory. They were able to take a number of, I forget which product line it was. It had something to do at the time with servers, or it could have been just disk storage, whatever it was. But they took a number of their inventory pallets that they had, and then they moved them away from the incident in Japan. They moved them to mainland China. And they were able to act in such a way because the data that they were pulling in was from weather data and, could have been financial data. They're just aggregate a number of different things. And they were able to pivot and move. And it was fascinating to hear about this from somebody who'd worked on this project with them. And it was a complete repositioning, almost what seemed to be on a dime. So that the ability for firms to shift their network structures like this, where their distribution centers are and where their inventory is located, it got me really starting to think. And it's what ultimately spurred my whole body of work in the past 13 years since, 12 years since. But we started looking at this, that was on the back of my mind. And then COVID happened, and everybody started talking about using buzzword phrases like, it's not just in time, it's right in time, or it's not just in time, it's just in case. And there's this pendulum swinging that happens with inventory and with procurement. So we started thinking and reading about, and not necessarily reshoring completely, but regional supply chains, thinking about it from the Americas standpoint, thinking about it from, of course, now USMCA, before that it was NAFTA, and so on and so forth. And so all of this taken together, it's this kind of malleability of the supply chain that became kind of an interesting thing. So then when COVID hit, the surveys happened, and the McKinseys and the Gartners of the world came out. They asked us, so what impact did COVID have on your supply chains? And the whole consensus behind essentially every study, and everybody was asked, and I'm sure if I spoke to each one of you all individually, you'd tell me the same thing, particularly in the procurement space, there's a need to make things more agile and flexible and resilient. And so looking at these examples in light of what happened during COVID, there was a number of kind of counter examples to this where it said, why did that happen? And one of my favorite ones was milk waste during the pandemic. And what ended up happening there was when school shut down, of course, those small little containers that every school child gets with their lunch were not able to be filled because the asset specificity of the machinery to be able to fill such a small container wasn't pliable over to gallons or half gallons or other sizes. It's not that people were consuming milk, it was just that they were consuming it in these sizes. And as a result, there was waste. You know, in some cases, they might have used it for animal feed or whatnot, but certainly it wasn't for its intended purpose. So that's something you think it's just bottling. Why wouldn't it be so flexible? And then I was looking at the way that alcohol was used during the pandemic, not the consumption, which of course increased, but the way that distillers and brewers were making hand sanitizers and other supporting products. So all of this got me thinking about this idea. It's like, man, what is resiliency? What is agility? What is dynamic supply chains? What does all this stuff actually mean? And the common tenet behind all of it to me was that it's this repurposing of resources along, within, and between supply networks. But for me, that's not good enough because my job is to answer questions that hopefully matter to somebody at some point. And I want to know, does this plasticity, shifting, whatever, does it really exist? And if it does exist, who cares? What's the implication of it? And so that gave us the whole start to this study. And so we had to kind of ground these concepts in what's been said already. So it all starts with risk, right? We all know what a risk is, but let's just define it to be clear. In the context of supply chains, in general, but as we're focusing on it, the risk is the likelihood that an adverse event will happen, right? And most people, when they're planning for risk, if you're all planning for, let's say, a supply interruption, there's a probability that certain products are going to have higher likelihood of a disruption than others. Disruptions end up happening when the risk occurs. So if I'm planning for that supply interruption because I'm Germany and I have this pipeline with Russia, but then there's been some geopolitical issues that have happened which have negatively impacted the flow. Literally, that's a risk which previously it wasn't a big deal. I don't think anything's going to happen. Now the disruption occurs when that pipeline stops. So the risks that lead to the disruption in this context make us think about how pliable, flexible, resilient, agile, whatever the case is, are our supply chains. And not just the supply chains, because that's a broad topic, but how agile and flexible and all these adjectives are each of these elements of the supply chain. So how quickly can you shift source of supply as it relates to energy? And this is what led to Germany, in fact, talking about putting on retired coal plants just to generate electricity, despite their shift towards more clean, less polluting type energy. So that's the context that we're studying in. But so what's been said, right? If you look at that McKinsey study, as I said, they said they want to be flexible, agile, and resilient. Okay, so what do these words mean, right? So what's been said in the supply chain, from a flexibility standpoint, people have said, okay, we need to be able to reconfigure. But when you dig deeply into what reconfiguring means, most of the conversation that's been happening around supply chain flexibility, particularly as it relates to operations and manufacturing specifically, even on the micro level, ability to reconfigure has been, can we retool processes? So that example of the milk being unable to be filled in different increments or different sizes because of how specific the machinery is, that is an inflexible process, as it has been said. So the issue here is, if we're talking about, as we have been, distribution centers and regional manufacturing plants, just shifting or augmenting or relocating to different countries, flexibility doesn't quite cover it. Firms should be flexible to be able to withstand disruption, but this is something that you have to build in ahead of time. It's not quite plasticity, and then you have agility. How do we adjust operations and tactics? Similar to flexibility, here it's more along the lines of, it kind of broadens out to the supply chain. It says, okay, if I'm being agile, this means maybe I have multiple sources of supply. Maybe I have, rather than I'm single sourcing, if I have the option to, of course, Maybe I have multiple sources of supply. I'm looking for avoiding bottlenecks in my supply chain with respect to the inbound flow of materials. So when a disruption happens, not if a disruption happens, really, when a disruption happens, we have to pivot to be able to operate back to the normal. And then there is resiliency. So what is resiliency? So all these terms, it's like, not alphabet soup, but adjective soup. It's like a stew of nonsense and chaos that we have to sort through. And luckily, this is what we've been thinking about for a little while. So hopefully my commentary on the matter will provide even a modicum of guidance. Or I could make you more confused by introducing another term. I don't know, leave a comment in chat, you tell me. Either way, resiliency is kind of the raison d'etre of risk management and disruption research. This is the whole point, as far as we know to date. To be resilient is to be able to withstand, adapt, and recover. But the key issue, maybe not issue, but the key assumption behind all of it is that recovering from disruptions means going back to the pre-disruption state. But I would just ask everybody to consider this. If we have been hit with a disruption such that there has been a significant downtime to operation, lost revenue, lost operating. I mean, going back, and this is all going to come together in a moment, I promise. Although, as Kathy knows, if you give me an hour to talk, I'll end up talking the hour. So, but nevertheless, I'll rein myself back in. The contrast between the two, the example that I was talking about before with Cisco being able to maintain uptime, I think the number I recall, someone would have to fact check me on this, but I think it was between 90 and 95% uptime during the Fukushima disaster and the tsunami and all that stuff. Whereas during that same time, you take a look at Toyota, the number that I read was that Toyota was down about 140,000 units of production post-disruption. Now, partly that goes to their co-locating the supply base and doing just in time and all of these things. But if going back to this resiliency concept, if my goal is to get back to pre-disruption operations, I would ask the following question. Should we go back to pre-disruption operations as they were? And this is where I think plasticity is going to come in, because it's not just a matter of being able to deal with and go back to something the way it was. It's being able to make all those changes to be flexible and agile and resilient and dynamic and whatever the word you want to use. But the key is that I'm going to make a change and I have a new way of operating. And that's the key part behind plasticity. So the way that we're looking at it is all from the firm's network and the structure of that firm's network. And so what we mean by that is if you take any supply chain network, and by that I'm saying focus on one focal company, the company in which you operate, and then look backwards and forwards. You look back, your tier one, you look at all the tier ones, which is your tier two, and then. And fortunately, given data collection capabilities and technology, we're able to see back, as I'm going to show you with this really cool data set that we were able to acquire to answer some of these questions, but we're able to look at a lot of this network structure. And what's interesting about it is, at least for me personally, I need a way to organize what are these different measurements, right? Because I'm an academic, I like to measure stuff, but I like to be able to talk to interesting people, not people like me who are super boring, who work in this stuff and say, hey, this is what I'm looking at. This is what my research is telling me. Help me see if this is calibrated correctly. So when I say network structure, what do I mean? First of all, we have to look at whether or not, and I'm going to go on my screen from right to left, how dense is the network? So for example, when COVID hit, the Wuhan area was the major supplier for almost all the intermediary work in process components for. And so I think the number was like 9,000 suppliers. It's some ungodly number that was concentrated. So from that part standpoint, this was super, super dense, which means that when a disruption hits, like COVID, and when trade flows are interrupted, like they were with COVID, and materials can't move back and forth like they were with COVID, is density a good thing or a bad thing? Well, with a risk here, but how tightly connected is something that we have to look at. And from a plasticity standpoint, as we're going to show you some examples of here in a minute, what happens when you change and shift? Well, you would either increase or decrease how tightly connected that network is. Meaning, do I co-locate all my suppliers like the Toyota manufacturing system? Do I have them right down the road so that, yeah, my lot size is 1, but when a disruption hit, my lot size is negative 144,000, right? So how tightly connected is that network? That's one element of how we can explain, or at least for how I can measure that network. So we call that density. The next thing we look at is we're going to look at network gaps. What is a network gap? This is a hole in the network. So the idea behind this came from a study that was done way back in 1950 something. You have to quote me on that. But the whole goal was, I wonder, the question was, how quickly could we get a letter to somebody in Boston from a random person not from Boston, somewhere in the Midwest, let's say. And the whole point would be, I would give this letter to somebody and I would send it and I would say, hey, send this to someone who you think should get this to Joe Schmo in Boston. And this is where the idea of the 6 degrees of separation came from. Because what they found on average, that the length of the connections in between was about 6. Why is this important to a supply network? Well, consider if you're looking at redundancy planning, if you're looking at multiple sources, or you're looking at the reliability of a supplier. If you have dependency on one supplier, you've got to know what their connections are and the degree to which they have connections, tier 2 to you, tier 3, and so on and so forth. So these gaps in the network, do we want to close them, become more dense? Or do we want to open them and say, let me have redundancy? I don't want to have all my eggs in this one basket, because when something happens, the whole network is infected. You can think about this too, when COVID did hit, just from a health standpoint, they were talking about figuring out who got it from whom based on the connections, right? So the field of epidemiology in biological and the natural sciences looks at these kind of things. So is a friend of a friend my friend from a disruption standpoint, from a plasticity standpoint? I don't know. We have to see. And then the connectedness. Here we're looking at basically how central firms are in the network, how important they are, and how many connections do they have with other firms. So these are the way that we're organizing the network. And what we wanted to test, what we wanted to examine in this context, is we wanted to see 2 things. Because my whole question was, A, does it exist? And then B, who cares? I mean, it's fun for me to think about these things, but if I'm guiding or instructing or advising somebody on this, once the empirical results have been fleshed out, we need to have a so what. So the first part that is going to ground and say, look, after this disruption, we're suggesting that firms, if plasticity exists, they're going to change those connections that we talked about, the degree to which they're more or less central in the network. They're going to look at whether or not they close or open up those gaps in the network. And then they're going to look at whether they should decrease density. Because the idea is, and it's logical, that if one supplier, one region, like the Wuhan area, is the major supplier for a component, a set of components, a category, even one line on the bill of materials, does it make sense to concentrate everything to that one area, or should we spread it out a little bit? And anecdotally, this is what ended up happening, and is happening legislatively, as you're seeing, when different bills that are coming out from an infrastructure standpoint are actually incentivizing manufacturers to move back, to produce domestically, to have larger control. I mean, it's a long, obviously, as we all know, it's a long timeline, but that's the idea. So the first test is going to look at when a disruption hits, what happens in the year following, right? What happens in basically T plus one period afterwards. And then the next is, okay, if they change their network, if this plastic concept exists, right, operating in a different way, because of course, restructuring and changing the way that the supply chain and the supply network is orchestrated, that's a new way of operating, onboarding new suppliers, finding new sources of supply, establishing new production facilities. If that happens, did it improve the downtime? So downtime is what we're going to look at in terms of firm performance. Downtime is massive, right? And it's obviously the impact of downtime is large depending on what type of business you're in, and how much safety stock, if there exists safety stock, if it's a service or a physical business, physical product that you're selling. So that's what we wanted to see. How do we do this? We did this in a really cool way by partnering with a company called DATA-RESILINC. If anybody's heard of DATA-RESILINC, that's great. If you haven't heard of DATA-RESILINC, I encourage you to take a look at them. They're a really cool company. And what they'll do is they kind of leverage crowdsourcing of information based on their clients. So they'll go to a client, they'll go to your company. Let's say you're the OEM and you're producing. So this isn't any service-based business. This is all manufacturing. So they'll go to a specific company and they'll say, lay out what your supply network looks like. Show me all of your production sites, where you receive product from whom you receive product, and so on and so forth. So they literally map out and enumerate what the entire structure of the network looks like. Really, really cool stuff. Then what they do is they leverage AI and web crawlers and any bit of information, kind of like that Cisco sense and respond concept. And they gather data and they're able to establish whether or not disruptions occurred. And these disruptions can be anything which could be relatively innocuous, like let's say a merger and acquisition. It's a disruption by definition because it augments flow, but it really doesn't necessarily augment the continuity of supply, at least hopefully. Or if it's something chaotic, catastrophic, like a flood, earthquake, hurricane, fire, or what happens if there's a legislative impact, like what happened with COVID, and there were pre-COVID with the tariffs. That's a trade disruption. That augments the flow. That could force companies to shift. You know, the story that I remember reading mostly about with the trade tariffs, aside from the price of my stocks going up by 20%, which I'm still mourning, but there was issues as it related to soybeans and pork going in and out. So there were farmers in the Midwest that produced a lot of soybeans, which were typically sold to China. When the trade tariffs happened, when Trump put tariffs on those trades, it augmented the balance of how much of those went to China because they became more expensive for China. So this balance back and forth, you know, that's a disruption, because then if I'm that farmer, I have to look for a new outlet to sell my products to. Labor strike. This is a big deal. It happened to shut down the ports in California and Long Beach in the early 2000s. You know, so net, the company is able to both map the entire structure and the crowdsourcing element that I was talking about before. What's really cool about this is that they're able to connect the connection. So if one manufacturer shares a common supplier with another, they can connect the dot there. And that's critical for us if we're studying how the network develops over time and changes over time. So it's a really cool data set that answers, hopefully, these two questions. So what do we find? Although I love to talk about this sort of thing, who cares? We found a couple controversial, from my standpoint, results. So looking at whether or not firms would change after a disruption in the second period, whether they would change those connections, how central they are, whether they would reduce those network gaps, or whether they would decrease the density, two of the three came to manifest itself as true. So density was decreased. So after a disruption, they found, well, firms at least acted on this idea that decreasing how densely and tightly connected you are, basically removing that Wuhan effect, would reduce downtime, would be a good thing. It's a beneficial thing for them to do. The next thing that they focused on, that we focused on and we saw, was that those network gaps, which you can look at it one way or the other. On the one hand, if you have more network gaps, you have access to whoever's in a position to broker the connection, has that kind of power play that they can do. So what ended up happening is after a disruption, the gaps were ended up closed. So that was good. Interestingly, though, we found that companies didn't necessarily reduce how central they were in the network, meaning the number and type of connections they had. Now, a number of reasons for this. It could be that they don't have the ability to. So they're in single sourcing relationships because they're producing some product where only one or maybe two suppliers, or they're dependent upon a government entity for their production, whatever the case is. But from my standpoint, 2 out of 3. So we have some kind of evidence here that says, yeah, firms change, plasticity might exist. It's not just thinking about bouncing back. It's more along the lines of bouncing back and then finding a better and newer way to do it. So essentially, the weird thing here, the good thing is we found some evidence of plasticity in the ways that we would have expected, in the ways that the previous work that's been done in this topic has shown us to be the case. Good. Weirdly, that one finding that they didn't change how central they were or change those connections or reduce those or increase it, because that's the other thing too. It's not just trimming off bad suppliers, it could be adding on more. And we didn't find any evidence of that from a statistical standpoint. The second test is, okay, so if it does exist, who cares? Why am I doing all this? Well, we found that it was actually the opposite of what we expected. So we found that when firms, though they should decrease the gaps, when they actually increase their network gaps, there was a reduction in downtime. So the way that we're viewing this lens from this perspective is, it could be that by increasing the gaps, they're becoming more self-reliant, which reduces downtime. So they don't have a dependency on tier 2, tier 3. That could be the case. The second thing that we found is that though we didn't find any evidence that firms would change after a disruption, their connection, how central they are, when they increase the number of connections, their downtime does, in fact, increase. So that is in line with what we saw initially. And then finally, the more densely connected, the more Wuhan-like things become, their downtime would increase when a disruption happens. So all this, what we're sitting here and trying to sift through, and any feedback from your all's experience would be wonderful from this. And I'd love to just have a conversation. I intentionally prepared this presentation with more of a discussionary type one. What did we find in the end? Do disruptions cause plasticity? Yes. Network structure definitely shifts. And 2 out of the 3 were found to be particularly important, which is closing those gaps and managing density. I think what we're going to ultimately look at in the future is there an optimal point of density, right? Is there a point of no return after which it's going to become too chaotic, where the benefits are no longer there and it actually becomes problematic? We'll have to see. The connections part we're still sifting through, which is I'd love to hear any feedback. And now the other interesting thing is, okay, so what, from a downtime standpoint, how long that facility was down post disruption or post augmentation? We thought that when you would reduce the gaps, well, we thought that, going back to the first thing here, that when the firms would actually increase them, make themselves more sparse, kind of more self-reliant, there was a reduction in downtime. Whereas what we thought would happen is, as you ally with more partners, you should ultimately see a reduction in downtime because you're building redundancy. But the other results definitely held. So in the end, I'd love to have a conversation about this, but I think the really cool finding is, and the key takeaway here is, in the post-COVID world, we're moving beyond simply thinking about, or at least we need to move beyond simply thinking about what being resilient means, because that just implies we're going to bounce back and go to the same type of operations. What we really need to think about is, how can we respond to that disruption, augment operations, and move forward and operate in a different way. So thank you all for entertaining this presentation. And if there's any questions, I'd love to chat. Let me just take a look here to see if anybody pops up. Let's see what we've got. Nathan had a comment here. Challenge to just-in-time strategy. Are the just-in-time days over? Does this recent disruption create a new supply chain ecosystem? So Nathan, it's a great question. And the way that I've always viewed it, and this could be just my bias from working with multiple companies and just anecdotally observing things, I think it's a pendulum. I really do. Because the whole just-in-time, go back to the 50s where you produced and then you sold, and everything was a push-driven supply chain. So then ultimately what ends up happening is, hey, we found out waste is a bad thing. So we need to trim waste and have a lot sizing of 1. Well, we're swinging this pendulum back towards the just-in-time. And now what's happening is, well, now we need to go to just-in-case. Ultimately, some consultants got to look at this in 10 years and say, those companies have too much inventory. I wonder if anyone ever thought about reducing the amount of inventory and having, just what we need at the right time. So I think, personally, I just think it's a pendulum. I think there's probably going to be some type of middle ground where you've got realize the value in safety stock if it's managed correctly. But to me, though, the funny thing about just-in-time has always been, yeah, it's reducing inventories for the focal company, but it seems to be that you're just pushing that inventory onto your suppliers, all these short deliveries and things like that. And then does the recent disruption create a new supply chain ecosystem? I think ultimately where this body of work is going to lead us down is that we're going to say that not only have, but perhaps supply chains and networks should operate like the body's immune system, where the resilient bit and because disruption management, this is my body of work that I've been doing for a while now. What we've come to find is that supply chain risk management can be broken down before now into 3 different categories: detection, mitigation, and recovery. Detection. What is detection? This is the sense and response, the sense part of it, figuring out where it's going to come from, how we can see and spot and predict the potential disruption, kind of the way your immune system does. Mitigate. This is why you take vitamins. This is why you exercise and do all these other things, such that when, not if, but when the disruption happens, you can respond. And then recover. That's whole, bouncing back and making decisions to pivot. But the plasticity piece takes the immune system analogy to the next level by saying, let's develop new cells in the body. Let's take these antibodies and be able to operate differently so that when I get inoculated by something, except the common cold, I know that I can respond and my body can fight it off ahead of time. So I think to answer your second question, yes, I think not only is it going to be a new ecosystem, I think the way in which the goal where it should go is something more along the lines of thinking about the supply chain like an immune system. It's a great question. Thanks for it, Nathan. I appreciate it. Any other questions?
It looks like Nathan has another comment. Also, it was fascinating to see Big Pharma collaborating in clinical trials to develop vaccines for COVID. It will be interesting to see if this silo busting continues post-COVID to develop and implement life-changing therapies. Any comments on that?
Yeah. So in the thinking around managing risks to the supply chain, it was really interesting to see cross-functional collaboration as a necessary condition, not an ideal thing that management would say. Absolutely. And looking at the way that the speed at which the vaccines were developed, that's a good probably post hoc for us. So that's a really good point, Nathan. It's a good post hoc for us to look at and see during a crisis, not after the fact, but during a crisis, maybe there's kind of a like micro level plasticity that's happening in between. You know, that's a really interesting comment. I'd have to think about that, but I like the idea. That's really great. Thank you.
Yeah, if anybody has any other comments, just put them in the chat for Stephen.
Hopefully I haven't put anybody to sleep.
No, it's a very interesting topic. I've actually never had anybody speak on this before.
You know, from my standpoint, from academic publishing world, there's been 3 papers that use the term, and the first one it was just kind of launching this idea in an editorial that said, hey, you know, when you're thinking about environmental management and supply chains, boy, we should think about this thing called plasticity. And then that got picked up by my co-author on this paper, and she tested it using operational repurposing, where they literally, during the crisis, it was the ventilators, it was GM repurposing operation. It wasn't quite plasticity. It was a way to you know, kind of almost case study it, but you know, it wasn't quite there. And then the next one looked at it was a case study. So the point is we're getting there, and it hasn't been spoken about yet. But hopefully we're gonna put a block in the wall and talk about it. But thank you so much for the comment, Maria, and for Eileen. Thank you. That's really kind of you to say. Thanks so much.
Do you see any future trends out there? What do you see going forward?
I think the big revolution in how this is orchestrated is going to be once it's full scale implemented, is the AI based predictive component. So it's only right now, I mean, it's only as good. And what I mean by that, by the way, if I wasn't clear, because sometimes I think something in my head is clear, but it might not be. But what I mean by that is, rather than saying, yes, we need to operate differently and move stuff around the network in different ways, I think making the decision of what that movement actually looks like and where to put it is going to be, once these patterns and enough data are gathered, that we can start thinking about it and saying, yeah, let's let AI give us recommendations, and then managerially we can say, this is how we should repurpose. This is why we should repurpose, kind of things like that. So I think, broadly speaking, the tech integration is going to be the trend that'll help not only disruption and risk management, but also moving forward, T+1, what do you do? So that's where in my head, that's where I see it going.
Wow, thank you so much. If anybody, do you have any other closing thoughts before we close out the session?
I think the key takeaway that I would again emphasize is just that rather than thinking about resiliency from the standpoint of operating back to what it was, because maybe we weren't as well prepared as we thought, think about it as operating back to where we were, plus an improvement to withstand the next chaotic disruption. That's how, the black swan, if you will, right? The rarity out there. That's how I would frame it.
Yeah, because there's always another disruption.
It will happen. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If anybody has any other thoughts they want to share, just please, let us know. But I will like to thank everybody for joining us today. Definitely you, Stephen. Stephen, do you have any future webinars that we could do on other topics that the audience might be interested in?
As of now, we're working on this topic for sure, but there's always something that could pop up. And if anybody has any recommendations or thoughts of a problem that they're facing and they want to email me, let me put my email in the chat. Or if anybody wants to talk about this, I'm happy to set up a call and chat. I like to calibrate my work against reality rather than being. Although my wife might describe me as a nutty professor. I don't want to be the guy who's up in a room just thinking about things like Mel Gibson and conspiracy theory. So I like to bounce my ideas off of practice. So if anybody has any thoughts that they'd like to help me out with that, please feel free to email me, and I'd love to set up a chat.
Oh, great, great. Should they connect with you on LinkedIn as well?
Oh yeah, that'd be great. You can just search my name. I should pop up.
Oh, sounds good. Now, by any chance, would you be able to share the slides with the audience or no?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, definitely. Okay, so once I receive the slides, then I'll send out a post email, as I usually do, to everybody with the recording. And that way you'll have another takeaway from the today's session.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. And we have 2 more programs next week, which we'll send you information out on. And again, thank you everybody for joining us. And thank you, Stephen, again, for bringing this topic to our community. We appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Take care, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.